By the fall of 1918, the armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary were disintegrating. Kaiser Wilhelm II and the Crown Prince both abdicated on the 9th of November and fled into exile. Wilson had demanded that the Kaiser be deprived of his throne before any armistice could take place. This now made it possible for the fighting to finally end. A provisional government was formed in Germany, led by the last imperial chancellor, a liberal aristocrat, Prince Max von Baden. This government sued for peace on the basis of a modified version of the conditions for armistice articulated by the American president, Woodrow Wilson, when the U.S. entered the war in 1917, his celebrated 14 points. The 14 points defined by Wilson were also accepted by the British and the French as their basis for any armistice. Moreover, they'd been seen as so attractive to the subject peoples of Germany and Austria that agents of the Entente had distributed them behind enemy lines in order to blunt the desire of the Alliance troops to continue the war. With the Kaiser gone, and with the imperial armies defeated, and with the Navy in open mutiny, there was no option but for the Germans to admit defeat. In so doing, they accepted the principles of the 14 points as the victorious powers required. And then finally, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, that is November 11th, 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. A delegation of French, British, German, and American officers met in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, just outside of Paris, in order to sign this armistice. Although the guns had fallen silent, there was still difficult work to be done before anything like a lasting peace could be achieved. Wilson was seen by many Europeans as the ideological man on horseback who would solve the problems of the old world with the vision and clarity of the new. When he first arrived in Paris, he was treated as a hero of the negotiations and one who would finally bring lasting peace, because great things were expected. And the idealism of the 14 points animated the dreams of many of those who hoped that this would indeed be a war to end all wars. However, the reality of the 14 points was directed against so many of the prevailing practices and so many of the prevailing ideologies of 19th century European empires that they didn't fully recognize the complexity of the history of Europe and the intractable problems that these points had merely brought to the surface. These points were expected to inform a lasting peace, but they were direct assaults on the nature of European composite states, an attempt to undo centuries of history and tradition. They demanded a redefinition of the boundaries, and they challenged the assumptions of an entire continent. The state system that had arisen at the Congress of Vienna in 1814-1815 had created a viable and lasting peace by recognizing the realities of European history and practice. It had been, as we saw, a pragmatic response to the issues and events occasioned by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Wilson's 14 points, however, were based upon a different set of assumptions. Rather than being practical and pragmatic in nature, they were idealistic, ideological, almost, in fact, romantic. Some of these points would cause difficulty not just for the defeated Germans and Austrians, but also for the victorious French and British. Nevertheless, it had been the entry of the United States that had brought an end to the war, and that had saved many millions of lives, and perhaps had saved the Entente from defeat. So the 14 points were accepted, and indeed accepted as constituted. The 14 points consequently represented a common brief. It was generally agreed that the details could be worked out later. And as in diplomacy as in life, the devil proved to be in those details. For example, consider point 5. An impartial adjustment of all colonial claims with consideration of the interests of the people involved. Germany, of course, was to lose her colonies. This was generally accepted. There was little debate about the fact that Germany no longer merited a colonial empire. But what about the colonies of the victors? These had been acquired and ruled with no consideration of the peoples involved. By accepting this point, were Britain and France and Italy also required to adjust their colonial practices? And we have to remember that tens of thousands of Indian troops had fought in the trenches for Britain, as had thousands of African troops from the French colonies fought alongside the soldiers of France. Did this then give them a right to more self-determination? Or perhaps even a right to independence, as was increasingly desired, at least on the Indian subcontinent? What moral obligations were then being formed? And to whom should the German colonies be given under Point 5? Should they be spread among the victors, or should there be consideration that perhaps the peoples who were ruled by the Germans should have some say in their own government? Other points demanded by Wilson would prove equally contentious, and in some instances virtually impossible to implement with any degree of consistency or fairness. This is especially true of those several points that address the issue of national self-determination, one of the fundamental elements of those 14 points. Those points that mandated the fragmentation of ancient composite empires into structures that would look like nation-states. This is not how Europe had developed. Nationalism, although powerful, was relatively recent in other considerations, such as economic links, transportation routes, defensible borders. All of these would have to be taken into consideration if the states that emerged after the war would have any chance of success. Consider point 9. The readjustment of frontiers should be effected along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. Add to this point 10. The autonomous development of the peoples of Austria-Hungary. And point 12, the autonomous development of the peoples of Turkey with the Bosphorus permanently opened. And finally, there was point 13, an independent Poland inhabited by indisputably Polish populations with access to the sea. Just briefly unpacking these points reflects the impossibility of Wilson's idealistic vision. The peoples of Austria-Hungary being divided along lines of nationality? How? Over so many centuries, the nationalities had become so mixed that lines could never be fairly drawn. The people of Austria-Hungary mentioned in point 10. What people? What recognizable lines of nationality existed in Central Europe? The nationalities had become so intermixed that no division was possible without cruel, indeed arbitrary separation. Germans had lived in Prague and in Western Bohemia for centuries. Romanians, Croatians, and Slovenes in the Old Kingdom of Hungary. Ukrainians in what would be Poland. And so it went. The Turks had been in Europe since the Middle Ages, and their empire in the Middle East was as complex as the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe. How again to draw these lines? And consider the case of Poland. Poland had not existed as a political nation since the final partitions in the late 18th century, with the exception, of course, of the short-lived and truncated Grand Duchy of Warsaw under Napoleon. Now Wilson demanded a new state be recreated, and one which would have access to the sea that would have to divide East from West Prussia, which would mean that Germany would no longer have a continuous border. And there would be the resulting destruction of economic and transportation links. And what of the non-Polish peoples who would fall into this new state, particularly Germans in large numbers? The reality was that the European national question was so complex that it couldn't possibly be addressed as any kind of reasonable solution without doing serious damage, not only to the history, but in fact to the very potential nations that the 14 points promised to bring about. No matter what Wilson hoped, history could not be undone with good intentions. Issues such as these made the determination of the final treaty a challenge, to say the least. To complicate an already difficult situation, there were the secret treaties, particularly the Treaty of London of 1915 that had brought Italy into the war on the side of the Entente. What about those secret treaties? True, they were not, as Wilson had idealistically demanded, been open covenants openly determined. On the other hand, hundreds of thousands of men had died for these treaties. Did their deaths mean nothing? Indeed, every line of whatever peace treaty that would ultimately emerge from the Great War was written in blood, and this had to be considered, and this was something that every nation recognized and felt necessary to acknowledge. The decision amongst all the victors had been to organize a comprehensive multilateral peace treaty, one modeled on the Treaty of Westphalia or the Congress of Vienna. This was to be concluded in Paris in 1919, at the Palace of Versailles, where, ironically, in 1871, the German Empire had been proclaimed following the humiliation of Napoleon III's France in that very year. All victorious parties were to be involved in the negotiations. And we must remember that this had been a world war, and most of the nations in the world identified an interest in the treaties that would end this war. With the collapse of the Turkish Empire, for example, the Turkish provinces of the Middle East became an issue. We only have to think of Lawrence of Arabia and his collaboration with the House of Saud against the Turks to know how difficult and contentious these issues could prove outside the European continent. Similarly, on the other side of the world, Japan had been an active participant, and so questions regarding the Far East became significant as well. And even China sent diplomats to protect its national interests at Versailles. The major point of departure from Vienna, however, was the decision to exclude the vanquished. In this case, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and their allies. The defeated powers would not be reconciled with the victors and offered a generous peace and a place in the community of nations, as they had been at Vienna, when France was brought back into that fraternity of kingdoms and recognized as, to some extent, a group of people who had been victimized by the war just as much as those who had won it. Instead, the vanquished nations were to be identified as pariah states. They were to be openly, actively, and aggressively humiliated. They were to be weakened to the greatest possible degree. At Vienna and previously, kings and rulers were held responsible for the actions of war. But with the Treaty of Versailles, the entire population of nations, such as Germany, would be made to suffer for the decisions of their rulers. It's not the Kaiser was guilty, the German people were guilty. The treaties, collectively known as the Peace of Versailles, there were many treaties, each usually given the name of one of the royal chateaux around Paris. But collectively, the Peace of Versailles imposed a harsh peace on the defeated alliance. The Allies believed that Germany in particular should be punished for causing the war. This exemplary peace, the Allies believed, was necessary for good to punish evil. There's no more dangerous time in any nation than when nations begin to believe their own propaganda. And the propaganda of the First World War had been explicit and vicious. The Entente were the forces of goodness, of freedom, of justice, and the Alliance were the forces of evil and wickedness and sin. But with the victorious major powers arriving in Versailles, there was no universal agreement as to how the 14 points were to be interpreted and the degree to which the defeated powers were to be punished. These differences would lead to further breakdowns of post-war relationships, as we'll see, and in fact ensure the instability of the continent in the interwar period. Ultimately, the terms of the peace were to be established by three figures: David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, constituted a fourth at the beginning of the negotiations. However, when the issue of the Treaty of London emerged, he left. He withdrew, and his delegation withdrew from the negotiations out of anger. Amongst these key figures, it was Wilson who was the idealist. Wilson, who had very little sense of compromise or much knowledge of European politics. And this made the negotiations problematic in the extreme. For example, Wilson, with little knowledge of European affairs, adamantly refused to recognize the secret treaties that had been signed by the Entente before the United States entered the war. And as we've seen, this in fact meant that the treaty given to Italy, the promises made to the Italians for them to actually switch sides, leave the alliance, and join the Entente, would in fact not be recognized. Refused the territory around the Adriatic that had been guaranteed by the French and the British. Orlando withdrew from the talks, and this, as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, had serious implications for the development of Italy between the wars. In fact, the rise of fascism in Italy and the stimulation of extreme nationalism and a sense of victimization resulted from what was considered by Italians to be a dishonorable and humiliating treatment that they had received at Versailles. Britain's Lloyd George was just the opposite to Wilson. Lloyd George was a consummate politician. He was a clever manipulator, but he was also a pragmatist. He cared very little about abstract issues like national self-determination. He even cared very little about redrawing the map of Europe. His interest was very precise: to protect the British Empire and to secure compensation for the sacrifice of an entire generation of young Englishmen, as well as the sacrifice of the accumulated wealth of the British Empire. For his part, Georges Clemenceau, the French prime minister, was a different personality yet again. He was a socialist. He was a Republican. He was cynical but astute. He was a professional politician who had lived through many of the events of the latter decades of the 19th century, who personally remembered the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War. And he wanted to punish the Germans so that they would never, ever again be able to threaten his beloved France. Clemenceau hated the Germans, and he truly believed that they must be punished in such a way as to vindicate France and restore her honor, which he believed had been compromised by the loss of Alsace-Lorraine and the humiliation of 1871. He also believed that it was necessary to weaken Germany so Germany would never again be a threat, that the French would be secure along the Rhine, and that they needn't always think that the Germans would once more arise in order to challenge the French state. So in other words, what he saw essentially is that the German arrogance of 1871 would be repaid in 1919. When the Germans were eventually given the terms that had been worked out through negotiation and compromise among the victors, they were appalled. And several ministers in the provisional government resigned rather than sign that treaty. But the victors were in a position to impose whatever treaty they chose. They issued the Germans an ultimatum. In June of 1919, they stated that unless the treaty as written was signed, the Entente armies still in place, this was just an armistice, remember, there was no peace yet, would march into Germany. The provisional government in Berlin was led by a socialist, Friedrich Ebert, and he was perhaps the last man in the German government with any kind of moral authority. He led the largest party in the Reichstag, and he had not been so closely associated with the Nationalist War Party that he, in fact, was tainted by the situation of 1914 to 1918. Moreover, he faced a situation in Germany that was just as desperate. He faced unrest from radical socialists and also unrest from right-wing groups at home. Ebert and his colleagues had no choice. They had to sign the document as written. But as they signed, they declared that they did so under threat of invasion. Thus, from the very moment that the treaty was signed, Germany opposed it. And this situation set the mood for Europe between the wars and the context for 1939. In fact, it's easy to see that the Second World War was really just a continuation of the First, with a 20-year truce. The Allies were essentially the same. Some of the issues were even essentially the same, because the Germans never fully recognized that the Treaty of Versailles was fair and just. It had been imposed upon them, and the entire purpose of those 20 years, as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, would be to try and undo the terms of that treaty, to restore some measure of German pride and some measure of German military power and authority. Well, why were the Germans so appalled? What was in this treaty that so infuriated them and drove them to such despair? The terms of the Treaty of Versailles were indeed punitive in the extreme towards Germany. First, Germany lost substantial territory. The provinces of Alsace-Lorraine were returned to France. This was understood. All parties realized that this would happen. Schleswig, remember, taken during one of the wars of German unification in the 1860s, was returned to Denmark. Prussian Poland was given to the newly reconstituted Polish state, which was guaranteed a corridor to the sea. And this corridor, this Polish corridor, separated East Prussia from West Prussia. And the German city of Danzig, now the Polish city of Gdańsk, was internationalized, but made part of Poland, the port of the Polish corridor. The territory of the Saar, the center of German industry and mining, was to be administered by the League of Nations, which was also formed at this time, as we shall see. And it was to be occupied by Entente troops until 1935, at which time it would not automatically return to Germany, but its future would be determined by a plebiscite to see whether the territory would ever revert back to Germany. The treaty sought to also limit the size of Germany's armed forces. It was agreed by everyone that German militarism had been part of the problem, had actually driven this war and provided the engine for some of its excesses. So there was universal agreement that Germany had to be demilitarized to a very great degree. So Germany was permitted a small volunteer army of just 100,000 men, but no more. Germany was permitted no air force. No troops or fortifications were to be permitted near the Rhine against Clemenceau, terrified that the Germans would once more cross the river and invade his nation. Nor was the building or buying of submarines possible, again remembering the danger of submarine warfare in the second half of the First World War. Finally, there was the humiliating and the economically punitive Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This clause forced Germany to admit that with her allies, she had caused the war through aggression. And because Germany had caused the war and wreaked this level of destruction upon the European continent, Germany was responsible to pay for this destruction. Thus, reparation payments were to be made to those states suffering the most damage during the war. The actual amount was not determined then. In fact, there was a great deal of debate within the Congress of Versailles to determine how and at what level this reparation was to be made. But nevertheless, the decision was ultimately to leave it to a commission. A commission was to be established to determine the amount that the Germans would have to pay. And when this report was received from the commission in 1921, Germany was assessed reparations amounting to $33 billion, an astronomical sum, which the weakened and unstable state was incapable of paying without economic and social catastrophe. We'll see the effects of having this national debt and the consequent inflation that destroyed the fiscal foundation of the short-lived Weimar Republic in the next lecture. Germany's allies were dealt with equally harshly under the treaties that bear the names of those French royal chateaux. The Treaty of Saint-Germain that was imposed on the Austrian rump of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire was just as harsh and ended forever the great Habsburg dynastic state that had constituted Middle Europe for half a millennium. The newly formed Republic of Austria had to recognize the independence of those nations that formerly had been part of the Habsburg crown: Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and territory that would form parts of the future Yugoslavia, Poland, as well as the South Tyrol, which was given to Italy. All of this land was taken from Austria. At the end of it, the former Austrian Empire lost 3/4 of its territory, 3/4 of its population, leaving the once mighty empire as a small landlocked republic with 1/3 of its total population located in the old imperial capital of Vienna. It's ironic that Poland was guaranteed a port, whereas Austria lost its access to the sea. And indeed, the port at Trieste, which was the main port of the Austrian Empire, began to decline into almost insignificance when the Austrians were so desperate to have their own access to world trade. Moreover, contrary to Wilson's principles of self-determination for nationalities, large numbers, very large numbers of minorities were incorporated into these new states, particularly Germans in Czechoslovakia and in northern Italy, and Hungarians in Romania. The realities of Europe had nothing to do with national frontiers formed by ethnicity, and the carving up of the continent would not solve, but in many instances exacerbated, the national problems, particularly in the states that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the victors had fought a war to end all wars, a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Consequently, the treaties had to institutionalize these dreams, to establish a mechanism to make them a reality. One way, of course, was the demilitarization of those powers that were generally believed to have caused the war. Another was to establish borders so that nationalism would operate internally and nationalism would become a glue among people. But the other was to establish international agencies that could then mediate amongst nations in order to ensure that war was not the only alternative to international disagreement. Woodrow Wilson truly hoped, and here he was an idealist, that the destruction of the German Empire would end militarism in Europe forever, ideally even the world, and that a League of Nations would replace the balance of power as the system to ensure international harmony and lasting peace. It too was a great and noble dream, but one that was very, very naive. The League was formed through the free association of most of the countries in the world. But from the beginning, the League was seriously weakened by the exclusion of Bolshevik Russia and Germany, both of which were identified as pariah states and hence outside the fraternity of civilized nations. Again, the lesson of the Congress of Vienna had not been learned. By demonizing the Russians and demonizing the Germans, putting them outside the international system, they were in fact being virtually forced to look upon the international community collectively as their enemies. Finally, the refusal of the United States itself to join the League, despite Wilson's dream and his own heroic efforts to have the treaty ratified, doomed the League of Nations. The USA had emerged from World War I as perhaps the greatest power on earth, certainly in its potential. And it had fulfilled a significant, in fact, a critical role in European affairs as a consequence of its involvement in the First World War. But this did not change the American personality. Wary of entangling itself in foreign affairs and anxious to avoid what were clearly very dangerous circumstances in Europe, the Americans returned to a policy of isolationism, looking inward rather than outward, rather than assuming the sorts of responsibilities that they had during the war, rather to see those responsibilities as now over, and they could then retreat back to their own continent and let the Europeans work things out for themselves. This isolationism was further reinforced by the crisis of the Great Depression, when in fact it was difficult for anyone to do anything because of the economic struggle that everyone faced. The League of Nations never really operated well as an instrument of peace. And when there were acts of open aggression that challenged the very principles in which the League of Nations was founded, the League did very little. In fact, the League essentially just talked. For example, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or more dangerously because a European power was involved and Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1936, the League could do little. The League had no power. The League had no army. The League could only make speeches and talk about some form of containment or some form of sanction. But in terms of actually imposing some measure of peace or some kind of sanction that would actually bite, nothing could happen. Speeches were made and sympathy offered, for example, to the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia after the Italian invasion, but nothing was done. The League did do good work, and we have to credit it for this. It did much to aid Europe's dispossessed peoples after the war. We have to remember that the creation of new nation states and the redrawing of the boundaries of Europe along the lines of ethnicity drove hundreds of thousands of people to seek homes with their fellow nationals rather than live as tiny minorities under the rule of others whom previously they had seen as perhaps their own subject peoples. So the movement of peoples was great, and it was necessary then to take care of these dispossessed peoples, and the League of Nations did a fine job in doing that. Similarly, it collected international statistics. In the best positivist manner, statistics on almost everything were collected. And this was particularly useful in helping, again, dispossessed people in providing the basis and the argument and the evidence for policy. But nevertheless, in terms of actually creating policy that would make a difference, nothing happened. It also, and perhaps this was its most important long-term benefit, it served as a solid foundation for the creation of the United Nations after the Second World War. But in its fundamental role, it could not reduce the world's armaments. It could not stop aggression, nor could it safely protect the world from the rising tide of totalitarianism, which was visible everywhere in Europe, but which no one seemed to be able to stop. With or without the League of Nations, the hopes of peace in Europe after World War I were very slim indeed, largely because of the way in which the peace had been imposed by the victors upon the vanquished. The great powers had forgotten the lessons of the Congress of Vienna, and Europe would once more pay the price. This is, to a degree, a failure of statesmanship. An opportunity had been lost, an opportunity that perhaps might have created a fairer and more representative and democratic and perhaps even more peaceful Europe. But the anger was too great. The sense of sacrifice was too large. The French and the British had sacrificed an entire generation of men. They now had to have an appropriate recompense. Moreover, they also saw their own basis of power. The British Empire was in fact in serious threat. The British economy had been almost completely destroyed by the war, and Britain was seriously in debt. The French, still terrified of the Germans and how German revenge might ultimately be wreaked against France once more, saw that there had to be a punishment that was so exemplary that Germany could never rise. This again was a failure of statesmanship, and the effect was to be felt in the outbreak of a war just 20 years after that war to end all wars. In our next lecture, we will see how the consequences of the Versailles settlement created a weak and divided Germany, an angry and humiliated nation waiting for that opportunity for revenge that the French and the British so feared.